We're going to resume now with our second panel of the day on the issue of language and translation. And this panel will be moderated by Seng Eugene. Seng Eugene is Senior Curator and Deputy Director of Curatorial and Research at National Gallery Singapore. And he's also a contributing editor to The Reader, where he oversaw the selection of texts from Singapore. So I'll leave it to Eugene to introduce the panel and the panelists.
Thank you, Phoebe, and warm welcome everyone to join in this celebration, really, the launch of our reader. And so the topic of our panel today is language and translation in Southeast Asian art writing. Right? So I think it's also really important that, looking at the earlier panel and also when Patrick and Kanaga shared their thoughts really about putting the reader together, we talked about the diversity of languages across and of course its complexities as well. And we're talking about so many different languages. And I think today in our panel, we will discuss about also the instability of texts, language and meaning. I think that's also important. Is our texts really that stable? Right, so maybe not, and they're constantly changing in terms of their meaning. So we'll be talking about that by focusing on terminology. Right, so some of the terms that we will be discussing later includes very, very fundamental terms like art, right, which we think it's stable, but maybe it's not. Right? It's something that's that has its own slippages, as well as the museum later, and also the politics of translation. Right? And being a reader that involves such intensive work in terms of translation, I think that's also an important topic that we'll be discussing about how the source texts have been translated into English, right? And in that way produces new texts, perhaps in terms of thinking about the afterlife of texts that have been translated and their circulation as well. Right, so it really gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker in our panel. So it's Roger Nelson. He's an art historian, curator, and currently an assistant professor of art history in the School of Humanities at the Nanyang Technological University. And we all also know Roger as well as a founding co-editor, right, of the Southeast of Now, Directions in Contemporary Art, Contemporary and Modern Art in Asia. And Roger himself, has been heavily involved in translating his own translation work, like Sun Sorin's 1961 Khmer novel, right? A New Sun Rises Over the Old, right? So that was translated into English and also winning an important award for that translation. So I'll now hand over to Roger. Yeah, Roger, thank you.
Thanks very much, Eugene, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's really a great pleasure to be here. So before I begin talking, I'd like us to watch a video together for about 1 minute in silence. Thank you. So what we just saw was a video of the acclaimed dancer, choreographer and scholar, Sopilin Chiem Shapiro, dancing at the Metropolitan Museum in New York earlier this year. Her dance was done without permission, and soon after the end of the video we just saw, she was ordered to leave by the museum's security. Her dance was conceived in part as a protest, calling for the restitution of the Cambodian statuary that surrounds her in the room we just saw. Statuary which many claim was illegally looted from Cambodia after the genocide of the 1970s. Nekru Sopilin's action was a dance, but it was also a protest, and also a prayer, and also a kind of offering. It was classical, and it was modern, and it was contemporary. Done in silence, it too was a kind of language and a kind of translation. So, as you know, I'm here today because I had the privilege of serving on the editorial committee for this publication that we're launching. And I have 4 small observations that I want to offer about language and translation. The practice of translation, now and historically, I think has often entangled the aesthetic or artistic with the political or diplomatic. The image we see on the screen now depicts a statue that was presented to Singapore by a Thai king in the middle of the 19th century, and it's now found just across the road from this building. On the base of the statue contains a message in Thai, rendered also in Jawi, Chinese, and English. These are relatively well-studied languages, but most of the texts that I contributed for this reader relate to Cambodia and Laos. The modern art of these countries has been comparatively less well studied for various reasons. And as a result, we decided to include texts that deal not only with modern visual art, but also with the arts and culture more broadly conceived in Cambodia and Laos. And thinking through this decision has been both useful and revealing. So the first observation that I want to make today about language and translation relates to terminology, specifically the terms that are used for art in a modern sense. The word art, I'm guessing, must appear hundreds of times within the 1,300 pages of this reader. But with each utterance, perhaps we will do well to remember to wonder, does it refer to the same thing? Is this art from this place at this time the same as that art from that other place in that other time? Or might there be as many understandings of art as there are artists or as there are languages? The title of this reader announces its concern with the modern, and we've heard quite a little bit about the modern from both Kanika and Patrick earlier this afternoon. But when reading the pages of this book, I wonder if we might see the modern and art as being mutually constitutive concepts. For art to be legible as art, it must be modern, and for the modern to be recognised as modern, it manifests in art. In the Cambodian and Lao languages, as in many other Southeast Asian languages, the words for art are very capacious. They encompass what in English we might call visual and performing and literary arts, and many other kinds of practice besides. Meanings, of course, multiply through the process of moving from one language to another. They become unstable, they take flight, and they shift in their shape. Together with 9 other scholars, including several other members of the editorial committee for the publication we're launching today, back in 2018, I collaborated on a research project that explored some of the histories and quirks of the terms used to discuss modern and contemporary art in this region. And this is just one of many examples of the ways in which the long and varied experience of working on this reader has generated new ideas and, importantly, new collaborations that have manifested and I'm sure will continue to appear in many ways, including beyond the 1,300 pages of this book. So my hope is that some of the linguistic possibilities enabled by attention to specific Southeast Asian languages, such as Cambodian, the notion, for example, that art might be an always plural and plastic term, which has different uses in different contexts and is often determined by quite extreme historical circumstance, that perhaps this may enable some insights into writings related to art in other parts of the region too. So let me provide an example. One of the texts I proposed for inclusion in this reader, and which I also translated from the Khmer, is about the possibilities and responsibilities of artists, meaning, as I said, of dancers and musicians and painters and writers and so on. This text was written in 1983 by the late Cheng Pon. Loktar Chengporn had been an influential scholar and choreographer in Phnom Penh before the genocide of the 1970s, which he survived. After the overthrow of Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge regime in 1979, he was central to the rebuilding of the arts, and by the time of writing this text in 1983, he had been appointed Minister of Culture and Information, or Propaganda. So this text that I'm about to read an excerpt from is reproduced with the generous permission of Chengporn's family, including the celebrated choreographer Sopilin Chiem Shapiro, who we saw earlier dancing her protest at the Metropolitan Museum just a few weeks ago. She's his niece. As I said, I think we can think of her dance also as a kind of translation and also as a kind of multivocal language. Chengporn very clearly sees artists in Cambodia in the early 1980s, communist and post-genocide period, as being part of an international community. He writes, and I quote, "At this time, I wish to inform all the nation's artists and all the artists of all the other countries to know very clearly about the great crimes of the genocidal regime." For Chengporn, this community of artists is one burdened with an unimaginable responsibility. He writes, and again I quote, "Do you care? How do you feel when you see books and documents, the works of marvelous poets from long, long ago, burning right in front of these men and women of literature? Can you bear to live in such darkness, such suffering, such terror, such anguish, fearing for your life, unable to trust anything, unable even to trust yourself? What of the progressive and modern ideas of the world? Have not all the artists in the world loved freedom in their performances and in their search for truth, justice, and creativity in all their activities? What do you think of the bitter suffering of our artists in Cambodia? This is the power of genocide, of reactionary ideology. Who will take responsibility for the weakness, the feebleness and emaciation of the 4 million people who have survived? Who will take responsibility for the stupidity, for the crazed confusion and bewilderment of those people who have survived? A little later in the text, Chengporn captures with startling directness the impossibility of this responsibility and the constraints within which art and culture always exist. He writes, and again I quote, "Dear poets and authors of the world, as an artist of Cambodia, I wish to inform you that I have no words to describe it all. It can never be said. There is a limit to the words of humans. There is a border containing that which we can say. We cannot speak at all. We cannot describe a suffering that has no boundary, that is limitless." For many of us, these words may be eerie, not only in the pain that they describe, but also in the recognition too. Theodor Adorno, the German-born writer, who also famously described the impossibility that artists and writers face in the aftermath of genocide. Writing in 1949, Adorno spoke about the impossible and yet unavoidable challenge of making art after genocide. His famous quote, which is in fact a slight misquote, is about what he called the barbarism of writing poetry after Auschwitz. It is very unlikely that Loktar Chengporn would have been aware of Adorno, the two men writing on opposite sides of the planet, but tragically only 3 decades apart, both sensed the limits of what art can do, the limits of what language can do, and the limitlessness that they are faced with. So, and this is the second point that I wish to make about language and translation, perhaps we can say that one of the things that translation does is make visible these moments of transcultural and transhistorical recognition and resonance, which is sometimes horrible and sometimes beautiful, and often both. So I'd now like to turn our attention away from this reader for a moment, which, as we've heard, gathers texts mostly written between the 19th century and the 1990s, and instead to look at a text, or rather a piece of writing, that was first published exactly 1 month and 1 day ago. It is an interview with the artist and scholar Tan Zahao, who lives and works in Kuala Lumpur, and it is concerning an artwork he made, which many of you may have seen, which was titled The Mercurial Inscription. The artwork revolves around the artist's reimagination of an artifact named the Terengganu inscription stone, which is usually dated to the early 14th century and usually considered the earliest surviving example of Jawi writing from this region. The text, the interview with Zahao, foregrounds the collaborative nature of translation. The artist explains that, and I quote, "The mercurial inscription has involved a number of people with varying expertise. I approached the translators first. There are 10 target languages and 12 translations." And so this is the third observation that I want to offer about language and translation. It is always collaborative. The process of moving a text from one publication to another and from one language to another is one that is always cooperative, collective, and the fruit of many labours. The book we are launching today is not only the work of its esteemed editors or its dedicated associate editors or even of the large editorial committee that you've heard listed for you earlier this afternoon. It is also the work of the many, many translators and the many teachers who taught us all. It's the work, of course, of the copy editors and the designers and the typesetters, but also of the writers and families and estates and publishers who generously granted rights and permissions for reproduction, and many others besides. All of their contributions, many of which are invisible, are also essential to the publication of the book that we have with us today. As an aside, I'd like to share that in translating some of the Cambodian documents in this reader, I found myself turning to colleagues from a wide range of disciplines, including political historians, for example, to query some obscure and now outdated Cambodian terminology. This showed me that collaboration is conceptual and epistemological just as it is practical and functional. Turning back to Tan Zahao, at the beginning of this interview, he affirms, and I quote, "I do not view translation as a representation of cultural inclusivity nor as an index of political correctness, but as a biographical inscription, as an expression in itself." Yet later in the same interview, Zahao explains, "I was exploring the topic of history and language with this artifact due to a nationwide debate in 2019 on the implementation of Jawi classes in vernacular Chinese and Tamil schools. The debate became intensely racialized as the Jawi script was inextricably linked to the Malay Muslim identity. The Chinese and Tamil vernacular schools were adamant about this imposition and sought for more conversations. Collectively, these anxieties revealed a society with deep-seated Islamophobia, Jawiphobia, and Sinophobia. My intent to translate an iconic object in the Jawi script is to consider how translation could play a role in navigating this conundrum. In the mercurial inscription, translation is a method of listening, a mode of care, and of attending to others." So despite his earlier claim that translation is not a representation of cultural inclusivity nor an index of political correctness, Tan Zahao's comments here reveal the ways that translation is always politicized and contested. He chose to move in multiple directions between 10 languages, including several so-called dialects. For the book that we're launching today, we've spent 8 years and who knows how much money translating I don't know how many Southeast Asian and European languages into English. So this is the fourth and final observation about language and translation that I would offer. It is always political, and it always involves difficult choices and exclusions. Yet it may also offer what Tan Zahao calls a method of listening, a mode of care, and of attending to others. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Particularly reminding us always that yes, translation is political, right? And how art and many terms that we use is also plural and plastic, and how translation is collaborative. And I think that's a way in which we can segue into Lisa's presentation that looks at the possibilities of multiple perspectives as a method in translation. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Lisa Horikawa, who is Senior Curator and Director Curatorial and Collections at the National Gallery Singapore, and of course, my dear colleague. Her particular research interest is currently focused on the impact of the Japanese occupation period on Southeast Asian art histories, and she has been working very closely with also Professor Masahiro Sorosoji in kind of furthering this very, very important research. All right, so over to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Eugene, for the introduction. Today, 153 paintings by more than 100 Japanese modern painters on the subject of war in Asia are quietly stored at the National Museum of Modern Art in Tokyo. We are depicting a wide range of subjects, from dramatic scenes of historical decision-making to fierce battle scenes, even quite violent scenes of bloodshed, to more sort of ordained, labor scenes under the Japanese occupation. These paintings, one may see them as records of Japanese aggression during the war, but they're also at the same time evidences and traces of the presence of Japanese artists in Southeast Asia during the war, many of whom crossed their paths with Southeast Asian artists. After Japan's war defeat, these paintings were confiscated by the US occupation force. Debates followed about whether to destroy these works as objects of propaganda, or if they should also see these paintings as objects of art. And now these debates were being made by the American forces who confiscated the works. And if these paintings should be considered as art, it's very problematic. What do we do with these paintings? Today, these paintings continue to exist in a perpetual state of limbo as objects designated on indefinite loan to Japan. Only a few paintings are shown each time in the museum's permanent gallery. Last year, Japanese contemporary artist Fujii Hikaru restaged an exhibition of all 153 works. But in his work, in his restaging, we do not see the images of the paintings in the recreated site. Paintings were faithfully reproduced to the exact size, accompanied by artwork captions, and yet their images are blank. Based on the size and the captions, one can only deduce and activate perhaps the memories that we may carry of these paintings in our head. But perhaps the empty surface inversely and eloquently speaks of the persistent taboos and shackles surrounding this history. Fujii's work reminds me of the state of the discourse on Southeast Asian modern art surrounding the Japanese occupation period. This period has been largely perceived as an interregnum or vacuum when the pre-war efforts to establish and modernize the institutions of art, be it exhibitions, art schools, artist associations, largely came to a halt, faced with the calamities of war. The devastations and losses brought by the Japanese occupation in Southeast Asia was, of course, immense. Needs to say that Singaporean, leading artist from Singapore, Zhang Ruqi, lost his life to Sukjin during the operation. But can the Japanese occupation period be understood only as an interregnum, a vacuum or void? Alongside the texts originally published in Vietnamese, English, and Bahasa Indonesia from the Japanese occupation period featured in this reader, there are 5 texts originally published in Japanese, of which 4 are by Japanese artists, critics, 1 attributed to, and most likely and presumably by Filipino artist Victorio Edades. These writings were taken from the Japanese newspaper published in Southeast Asia, as well as art magazines published in Japan during the war. The Japanese occupying forces mobilized their Japanese cultural workers, including visual artists, to carry out the cultural propaganda in Southeast Asia. Amongst the texts selected for the reader was one by war painter Mukai Junkichi, who reveals in this text his early vision of the cultural propaganda activities in the Philippines. proposing to organize or establish an art association for artists in the Philippines, and even quite ambitious idea to organize an exhibition that could travel not only to multiple sites in the occupation region, but also in Japan. And him making promise to the artists in the Philippines of finding more art supplies. Fujita Tsuguharu, who was the forefront of war propaganda effort, was sent to Vietnam to act as a cultural ambassador in opening the French Indochina Traveling Exhibition of Japanese art in 1942, in which he boasted of its huge success as having attracted 15,000 visitors. One of the most remarkable moments of exchange between Japanese and Vietnamese artists was the exhibition of contemporary Indo-Chinese painting that traveled to 5 different cities in Japan in 1943. And with it, 3 Vietnamese modern artists invited for a study trip to Japan. Okay. Many of the texts selected for the reader were unearthed originally by the Japanese art historians of Southeast Asia or of Japanese, or modern art over the last 20 years. And I really wanted to use this opportunity to acknowledge that there's really a accumulated, depth of research that's been conducted in Japan on this topic. Using primary sources in Japanese, sometimes Southeast Asian languages, as well as colonial languages, these researchers have really built a wealth of research over the last 2 decades. But regretfully, these emerging research coming from Japan, and this is also a statement to myself, including myself, have not been translated to other languages like English and incorporated into the discourse of Southeast Asian modern art outside of Japan to date. But given that the Japanese source materials were originally written for the Japanese audience, such as the Japanese civilians, officials, soldiers, one may question why there is even a need to translate these texts for this reader for the study of Southeast Asian modern art. By glancing through the Japanese texts selected for the reader, it becomes readily visible that these texts clearly served Japanese propaganda purpose and the ideology of the greater East Asia called prosperity sphere. The Japanese gaze on the art of the local area often involves around the rhetoric of the Southeast Asian artists having lost their true self, and they stress the importance of nativizing. It writes that it is through the encouragement of the Japanese that the artists in Southeast Asia are able to discover their lost true self towards developing a new art that is truly rooted to their land. Now, this situation is further complicated by when similar ideological rhetoric of nativization and pursuit of the Asian spirit appears in the writing by Southeast Asian artists, such as this one by Victorio Edades. In fact, the Japanese text published under Edades' name is even stronger in its ideological tone than those written by the Japanese writers. Reviewing the second art and architecture competition and exhibition organized by Kalibapi, or the Association of Service for to the New Philippines, in 1944, Edades writes, "The works in this exhibition give the impression that painters of the Philippines have opened their eyes for the first time to the beauty of our islands, landscapes, people, and customs. The art world of the Philippines is in a time of awakening." And in a manifesto-like tone, he calls all the peoples of East Asia must find a path to unlimited progress within the framework of Hakko Ichiu, or otherwise the 8 corners of the world under one roof. As we've yet been able to find an English version of this text, we are unable to ascertain whether this text was translated from an English text written by, penned by Edades, or edited, or even written by a Japanese editor. But having said this, art historian Furusawa Yuria writes that given that the Filipino artists' drive towards finding a unique form of Filipino art was already found in the decades preceding the occupation, there is the possibility of Edades using the opportunities of the exhibition arising from the occupation towards pushing or driving his own agenda for the pursuit of modernism. Similar aspirations for the pursuit of Asian spirit is also echoed in the Vietnamese writings by Tho Ngoc Van, reflected on his study trip to Japan in 1943. In these instances, the act of reading between lines, it's in-depth reading of the context and connecting them with other writings published from the period by other writers becomes imperative. As difficult and complex it may be, the actual impact of such pan-Asian thinking on the artists or the possibility of Southeast Asian artists acting their self-agency amidst the relentlessly one-sided power dynamics of the occupation period awaits further exploration. Okay. Research conducted for this publication also uncovered some new materials, unveiling the intimate exchange between Japanese and Southeast Asian artists, such as this text between Miyamoto Saburo, who painted the famous painting of the meeting between Generals Yamashita and Percival, and Victorio Edades in Manila in 1944. This text, together with another essay written by Japanese art critic Egawa Kazuhiko on the Vietnamese artist's study trip to Japan, unveil the unexpected connections and encounters that have been scarcely written in the artist monographs or art historical texts on artists of both Southeast Asia and Japan. Miyamoto's detailed account of the books that he found in Edades' studio also reveals the range of reference points that Edades was using at this point. Egawa's observation of the three Vietnamese artists is a curious one. He describes of the repeated instances in which the expectations of the Japanese artists who hosted the Vietnamese artists and those of the Vietnamese artists did not cross or meet with each other's. Contrary to the Japanese expectations for Vietnamese artists to show interest in the contemporary Japanese style painting and what they thought of them, the Vietnamese artists would not engage with these questions, and instead they paid attention primarily, this is according to Egawa, to the technical side of art making. So a cross-reference of such texts with those by the very same Vietnamese artists which are published in this volume or beyond, may reveal a more multifaceted account of one of the most significant exchanges between Japanese art world and Vietnamese artists that took place during the occupation period. Over the last 20 years, there's been a series of efforts by art historians in Japan to question the limitations of the conventional framing of Japanese art history. The anthologies of essays published in 2006, and perhaps especially the more recent publication in 2012, The Empire and Art, position art, produced during the war clearly as manifestations of Japan's imperial desire on the others. In 2014, an exhibition was co-organized by curators of Korea, Taiwan, and Japan that re-examined the legacy of the series of official exhibitions that were organized by the Japanese during the war in Tokyo, Seoul, Taipei, and Changchun, or Manchuria. While such efforts and collaboration, we've been seeing such collaborations for East Asia, such efforts have not materialized so much for Southeast Asia of this period, concerning this period. The small group of Japanese writings selected for the reader definitely awaits further investigation and perhaps retranslation into other Southeast Asian languages. The work of re-examining the Southeast Asian art during the so-called interregnum of the Japanese occupation period that is fraught so much with trauma or the legacy of the ideological rule and power dynamics can only attain its much needed nuance if it's conducted collaboratively through a multi-perspectival approach, which may kind of echo with what Roger said about translation as a collaboration act. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, and really for reminding us as well. And earlier we were talking about how translation is political and how, texts themselves are also not neutral and embody, their own politics, right? And I think a really important point you brought up was really about how the translation of Japanese texts on art during the Japanese occupation helps to fill a gap in art history. I think that's a really, really important contribution of this reader. Right, so next we have Simon Soon, right, who is senior lecturer at the University of Malaya. He's also an art historian and curator, and previously co-editor of the anthology Narratives of Malaysian Art, Volume 4. He's also a member of the editorial collective Southeast of Now, and he has been working on the crowdsourced Jawi to Romanized script transliteration. And I think that's also a very important project that's very relevant to our discussions that focuses on art, right, in the Malay language, the 1950s and 60s. All right, so Simon, over to you.
Thank you, Eugene, and thank you everyone for being here today. I want to congratulate National Gallery, CCA, and everyone who's put in so much work for this huge undertaking. I'm very pleased to be, part of this long 7 to 8 year journey. I think, so what I'm going to do is sort of like share a bit of my perspective leading into looking at one of the case study, perhaps of a research trajectory of mine that has in part been inspired a lot by some of the things that we've been thinking a lot together collaboratively through bringing this book into fruition. I think the unique pressure in co-editing this and selecting the Malaysian text is the pressure of having to work with someone like Prof. Tanaga, who knows the history of Malaysian art from the perspective of having lived through at least a quarter of the time period stipulated in the Modern Art Reader. So there was a lot of pressure on my part to make sure that I pass his vetting, or my selection passes his vetting. Importantly, I think what he brings to the table is that he makes a lot of insistence that texts are included through the persistence of being inclusive. That's something that I've learned a lot along the way, and this inclusiveness can be political and also ultimately really illuminating, such as the inclusion of a genealogical record of Papua Kumbu weavers. That we keep going on and saying that we need to have Borneo in the mix, but try as we may, it took a while to even figure out how to bring in the story of Sabah and Sarawak. And it was through the hard work of Kananga and his insistence that we have this. While I was very busy trying to piece together some of the earlier writings, he made sure that I also address some of the important and seminal writings from the 70s and 80s onwards. Because this is important, because we wanted to capture the multilingual realities of Malaysia, which, of course, like Singapore, saw not only language silos, but language fields where writers were often writing with the awareness of the multicultural landscape that they were situated within, right? And this has later on, of course, spurred me to look at, Jawi transliteration, and also later on Chinese articles in newspapers and books from the early 20th century. And this helped me to push research thinking towards also the Terminologies project of the modern. Transnationally as the one that Roger edited for Southeast of Now, specifically thinking of the relationship between Malay and Indonesian languages and the cross-influence that they have in terms of how generative it is as a sort of conversation. I think one of the things that was that we missed out in this the Malaysian section was a 1929 text looking at that was in classical Chinese, and then we realized we did not have the expertise to sort of like bring that translation into fruition yet, and so there are also sort of like misses that could be sort of like taken up further on. So one of the things that I was particularly sort of like taken by is like, thinking through terminologies and things like that. And perhaps what I can share here is my fascination with the word museum in the Malay language from the earlier period, from the 19th century all the way to the present day. Let's see, which is what I'm trying to sort of like present here to all of you. So survey of sort of like Malay and Chinese sources was particularly productive in suggesting from the late 19th century onwards, there were already acknowledgement of institutions that promoted some kind of memory practice. However, the terminologies used were varied, like as suggested by Roger just now. These terms are never always quite fixed. Scholars like Prof. Muhammad Taib Osman did suggest that initially, the word for museum in the Malay language was ajaib khana, right? In the Jawi Peranakan from 1893, we see the use of this word in the Malay language. Though Arabic, it is of Indo-European, Indo-Persian sort of like loan term. Khana refer to a hall, a roof gathering venue, therefore suggesting the museum was seen as a kind of hall of wonders, or that's something that can accommodate strange things. Unfortunately, I haven't been entirely successful in finding other examples other than the only one that Prof. Muhammad Taib Osman used as his example, shown here on the screen. The mention of the word ajaib khana in this case was found in the Jawi Peranakan newspaper. Here, it mentions that in 1893, the newspaper made an appearance and was shown to visiting public who came to see the Ajaib Khana at the Chicago World's Expo. The word used for World Expo is penontonan. Yeah? So it was likely a reference that took inspiration from the naming of the Lahore Museum, the Ajaib Ghar. And for those of you who know your English literature, might also know that this was where John Lockwood Kipling, Rudyard Kipling's father, once occupied the position of curator. And given that the Jawi Peranakan newspaper was owned by a local Indian Muslim community, it was likely that the term was adopted and used in the Malay language and circulated largely in the urban milieu of the Straits Settlement. Instead, from the 1890s onwards at least, a more widely used term for the museum connected the museum with pictures. Okay, the word pictures, either as rumah gambar or tempat tengok gambar or sekolah gambar. Historians of museums have in the past produced a historical timeline tracking the change of meaning from ajaib khana in the 19th century to sekolah gambar in the 1950s to the word museum, which is used from the 60s onwards. But I think if we look at historical sources, this type of timeline is often too neat and linear. That sekolah gambar was already widely used in the early 20th century and all the way back to the late 19th century brings into question that the conventional narratives that tends to identify sekolah gambar as a term that only gained popularity from the post-war period is perhaps not quite accurate. So in turn, the term museum was also used as early as, the early 20th century. And it seems like both terms were widely accepted and understood to mean museum. And in both uses, the sekolah gambar was a place to be schooled, and the medium was the museum. So far, we have been looking at, these wonderful instances where we see the word museums being used in various sort of like contexts in Malay newspapers. But how is also the museum sort of like, what do sort of like local actors bring to our understanding and perspectives of the museum? What type of reflective record might we find? Unfortunately, that is not included, for example, in the reader, perhaps hinting at the need for more investigation, perhaps a reader that looks at writings on the museum itself. One example of this account is from Huang Qiang, a Chinese general who visited Malaya around the end of June or early July in 1926. His daily observation was subsequently published in a planned 2-volume travelogue, Malay Hong Xue Lu, in 1928, reprinted in 1930. It is likely only that the first volume was ever published, as no second volume is in existence today. In chapter 53, his description of the Selangor Museum offers a unique non-European perspective. He noted the prominence of the elephant display on the entrance, behind which are vitrines, and a model next to a model of a warship is featured with the word Malaya printed on it, and a torpedo. Then he spent some time explaining the ship's significance, attributing it to the fundraising efforts of Malayan during World War I. He also noted how popular the warship model is as a museum display, attracting visitors from all corners of Malaya. Huang Qiang was less impressed by the 2 sections featuring plants and animals. He didn't think it was that exciting. There was also a section on mining, covering on gold, tin, and coal mine, featuring different methods and technologies of extraction, with Nanyang examples featured. That's why he said. Here, he notes that the information was extensive and educational, but wished that the machine could be demonstrated and made interactive, since this were just miniaturized model. He suggested there could be someone there to demonstrate how these things could be operated. And what this does is that you have this really fascinating account, at least from a non-European perspective, that the museum was interesting, not necessarily as a repository of just old antiquaries or old artifacts, but also for its ability to accommodate modern technology and sort of like innovation, right? And this was fascinating to museum goers at that time. And I think it is accounts like this that we begin to see a pluralization of different types of like perspectives. When we look at writings of the day itself, it need not only come from artists, it need not only come from curators or people who can speak from, a position of authorities, but we are increasingly also encountering texts that really show the democratization of perspectives when it comes to art. And that, to me, is always the most exciting part about engaging with writings from the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. And I totally feel you. If you're dealing with, I forgot to share that we are all contributing editors to the reader. So myself on Singapore, Simon Malaysia, Lisa on the Japanese occupation, and Roger on Cambodia. So you can imagine my feelings about Singapore, and of course, I work closely with Kanaga on the selection of the text as well, which I found it very productive. I think what is also interesting, I find, is about through the production of this reader, right? What maybe we have created is a kind of relationship between texts, right? And I think we have sort of intimated a bit about this. And of course, Amaruddin, I think he talked earlier about how we are being circumscribed by the national, right? The kind of nationalist discourse or nationalist framework. And I think this reader is an important step for us to also break out of this, to look at new relationships, between texts across, national boundaries, find new families, find new friends, right, in between these texts. I think that's really, really important, and I think an important contribution of this reader. We have a bit of time, all right? We have a bit of time, so I'm just going to start off with a question and then open to the floor, so that we can have questions or take questions from the floor as well. Earlier I talked about, how about, language, being the instability of language and how language changes over time. So I'm wondering if we could ask, all three speakers today, so are there terms or texts that you found kind of untranslatable, right? And, or, how do we translate terms from source language that have multiple or unstable meanings? I think, in a way, Simon, you've also talked about it, now using about this term, the museum, and Roger has talked about art as a kind of plural and plastic term. I'm sure Lisa will also have some examples as well. So yeah, please, if you could share with us. Roger, you want to go first?
It's a really good question. Two terms come to mind. One is the term that usually translated as propaganda from both Khmer and Lao. And there's some interesting scholarship that suggests that this term, which is usually translated as propaganda and which can nowadays also be used to mean information, could perhaps be thought of to mean rhetoric. So it's a kind of, it's a way of communicating that always already has a point of view embedded within it. And it's, for many decades, been proximate to the terms for art, because what is art if not something to put next to information and rhetoric and propaganda? Some other terms that come to mind relate to the communist period in Cambodia. There were strange terms, strange kind of compound words, which were very unfamiliar to me. So I started by asking some friends who were also baffled. So then I thought I'd ask some artists, they were baffled. So I asked some translators, they were baffled. And it was only after sort of several rounds of questioning that I thought of asking a friend his name is Tun Tira, he's a scholar of Cambodia's political history, now based at Hong Kong University. And he was able to tell me that these were sort of strange Cambodian translations of Marxist terms for things like consciousness raising and so on, terms that happily have fallen out of usage today.
For me, I guess the question was more about how to deal with the propagandistic nature of the text more than the use of the terms themselves, because really the text was seeped with such a strong, political tone and agenda, right? So how do we, read between these lines, and is it ethical to even translate these texts, right, to English? But I think we had to make a decision, and we did sort of, try to keep not neutral, but translating it or somewhat keeping it as faithful as possible and providing that necessary context through the background notes as much as possible. But I'm sure there are other, more appropriate ways maybe, but this is just a first step, yeah.
Quick in my response, though, the most immediate thing that I can think of would be a word that we assume that to have common knowledge about, the word seni, right, in the Malay language, which is something that really only came into popular usage to describe any form of, say, artistic endeavor from the 1930s onwards. And especially especially in the use of the word seni lukis, how to adequately sort of like translate this word. Ucho just now gave an example of how it can be translated as painting, but very often in its usage, for example, in the National Balai Seni Lukis Negara, it tends to sort of like convey a meaning that is more than just institution that was interested in collecting paintings, right? Its usage in that context would sort of like mean a national fine arts institution. So in trying to sort of like choose an English language, an adequate English language of like translation, I think we have to sort of like be aware of its specific sort of like deployment, and that and these deployments might not always be stable, as what Roger has sort of like highlighted before.
Yeah, thank you. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge these nuances and how slippages in the terms that we use, and in terms of how we translate them. right? And I really like, Simon, what you talked about, the deployment, how this term was used in a specific context. It could be a cultural, kind of a context. But maybe I just want to push Lisa a bit more, because I was quite fascinated by, you were grappling with this really strongly, right? You even mentioned, is it ethical to translate these texts? And you were trying to develop, in some sense, a methodology, perhaps, through translation, to enable us to unpack, the nuances further, right? How can we break out of this kind of rhetoric? You mentioned between the lines, or we could read against the grain, for example, or to use the head notes. So these are methods. So can you maybe talk a bit more about your thoughts on this, Isa?
Well, it's a tough question, because I think it was really a trial and error, and I wouldn't say that the method we took was perhaps the faithful, the truth way of doing things. I don't think there's any perfect translation, right? It comes down to that. But what I guess still encouraged me to work on the project was the fact that this text will be presented alongside other writings by Southeast Asian artists, right? And how the gazes and the subjectivities may cross with each other. If I were to just present the Japanese text that I recommended just by themselves, I think that's quite problematic. But it's that relationship that texts create between each other, the gazes, the cross sections, that somehow gave me the courage to read those texts, because it's quite disheartening, right? The heavy weight of these texts.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. So maybe now I'd like to open to the floor. Uta?
This is maybe a question to everybody, because we didn't have a Q&A earlier, and also to, literally everybody involved in the project. I mean, when we started on the project with TK, as we said, it's a kind of a lifetime project to finally create attention, space, and awareness, not only of art history, but history of the region. That is, of course, a pre-colonial, a colonial, and a post-colonial, hopefully. Where is a home for this? Like this is, it's not just multilingual, multinational, it's also multi-generational. Where is the space for such research? And we're really grateful that Eugene and the National Gallery took this over, because it started at the CCA, which kind of was an unlikely place for this research. But as we said, TK was the first fellow of our center, and we are very grateful to TK to also show us our place as a contemporary center for art in this wider geography. One could almost call it a psychogeography. And where is the space? Because the research that we get usually for this should come from our ministries, but they're usually national, disciplinary, and not even including art history as part of history. So where can we find the space? Because as you rightfully say, this inquiry, this project raises so many more questions, and so many more spin-offs would be required to really look into. I mean, Lisa, what you said, we have similar issues if we have colonial languages that often are derogative. Do we translate these? But on the other side, they are part of history. So how does a younger generation deal with this? So I think there is so much importance in this project. So I really wonder, and I ask literally everybody, where do you see a home for the continuation of this incredible endeavor, where we cannot thank enough to Patrick, TK, and of course also Eugene and the NGS?
Eugene, or Patrick, or Kanaga? Yeah.
Patrick and I were just discussing the answer to Uta's question. We think it lies in the universities. So as we know, the National Gallery has been working with NUS on an art history minor program, right now a minor. Roger's involved with art history at NTU, and there's soon going to be art history at La Salle as well. So hopefully in one of these institutions, in different ways, I can find homes for some of these research, right?
Don't know where I can be representative in making these comments. I don't think where we are, and I'm not so sure if we were anywhere else, there would be any single site that would be able to undertake something like this, or even if the will is there. That it has been anchored in two art-run institutions, initially during the span of the NTU CCA and then now with the National Gallery, and that it has been undertaken by these institutions and completed is, I think, exceptional. And in my view, this exceptionality, and we are accustomed to celebrating exceptionality in Singapore, will need to prevail. However cumbersome and difficult it is going to be, because I imagine that Eugene, as the head honcho here, notwithstanding your persuasive capacities, will have to declare the usefulness of something like this to your own board and so on and so forth. What is a gallery producing 2 volumes without a single picture in it? You know, come on. This is whose job is this? This should come from a department of languages or something like that, that produces dictionaries and thesauruses or something like that. I say this not despairingly. I say this with great, I would say, confidence in the conviction of certain of these institutions here. And now that we have established some kind of networks through the region, albeit through individuals, and these persons like Simon Girtia are also in their respective institutions themselves, that could be corralled into greater public kind of activities. The second part of your remark, I'm not so sure I'm qualified to say this, although I teach the very people who are very puzzled about anything that is 2 weeks old. But what do we do with this thing that happened in 1910? Why are we looking at it, you know? What is there for me in it? And then I say, go and look for it. They say, no, I have other things to look at. That I think is an even greater chasm to try and deal with psychologically and it through practice. But I have confidence in the youth that's in front of us, and you better be the youth, Simon. And I would like to be around you guys for a bit longer. But I don't want to trivialize your question. I think it's a very important one, and we got to stick with such practices that we are able to do with and do them as fulsomely as possible. And I'm sure there are such persons who will do these things. I certainly hope that this is not seen as some kind of a tombstone, that nothing needs to be done after this horror of horrors. Then we should chuck it, kick it out somewhere.
Thank you, Kanaga. I think we don't have enough time for another question. I'm so sorry about that. And we should continue to the last part. So I would like to invite Phoebe to come over. Yeah, Phoebe.
Thank you so much to our speakers and the panel. If you could join me in thanking them for the. So, before we conclude today, I have one very last important matter, which is I'd like to take the opportunity on behalf of the editors to thank someone who has not had a speaking role in the proceedings today, but who was very instrumental in bringing the reader about and making it happen. Patrick earlier described her poetically as the immovable object which met the irresistible force of the reader. Others might know her as a meticulous proofreader, an indefatigable copyright clearer, a late-night citation checker, and it must be said, a very insistent emailer. But on behalf of the editors, we'd like to present a special token of thanks to our project editor, Charmaine Un. So, oh my God, she literally ran away. Please come to the front. Because without your hard work and meticulous efforts, we wouldn't have been able to bring this book to publication. Thank you. So that concludes our program today. Thank you so much to everyone for staying with us through this extensive program.